Jax's revenge domain. I watched Derek Collins click to the next slide, my pulse pounding as he displayed my quarterly risk analysis to the entire executive board. There it was. 22 years of my methodical work being systematically torn apart by red circles highlighting supposed flaws in my calculations. As you can clearly see, Derek announced, his voice dripping with professional concern, these projections deviate significantly from modern analytical standards. My name is Michael Reynolds, I'm 48 years old, and until that moment, I'd built my reputation as the most reliable risk analyst at Keystone Financial. 22 years of proving myself, of keeping clients safe through market crashes, of being the guy leadership turned to when things got complicated. I wasn't the flashiest presenter, didn't throw around buzzwords like synergy or digital transformation. I just did the work, did it right, and delivered results that kept our firm's reputation solid. Derek gestured to a side-by-side comparison where my traditional risk models looked wildly different from his sleek AI-generated charts. The boardroom felt suffocating as 8 pairs of senior executives leaned forward in their chairs. I sat completely still, keeping my Marine training composure despite watching 3 months of meticulous work getting dismantled before my eyes. In the Corps, we learned to observe before acting, to assess the battlefield before making our move. This was no different. The volatility patterns shown here, Derek continued, pointing to my custom stress test models with a laser pointer, completely misrepresent actual market conditions using outdated methodologies that frankly have no place in modern finance. We're talking about approaches that might have worked in the 1990s, but today's markets require sophisticated algorithmic analysis. Director Patricia Wells removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The gesture reminded me of my old commanding officer when he was about to deliver bad news. And you're certain about this assessment, Derek? Absolutely, Derek replied without hesitation, his confidence unwavering. I've run the numbers using current industry-standard AI algorithms. The discrepancies are substantial and concerning for a firm trying to compete in today's market. We can't afford to rely on legacy thinking when our competitors are leveraging machine learning. I watched silently as he flipped to the next slide, a complex risk assessment model I'd created after weeks of research, working late nights while my wife Sarah waited dinner for me. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek was criticizing work he'd studied extensively, asking me detailed questions about every component just months earlier. Derek's voice took on that condescending tone I'd grown to hate over the past 6 months since he'd started positioning himself as the firm's digital transformation expert. Most troubling is this crisis prediction model. It employs conventional mathematical approaches that generate projections completely out of alignment with machine learning principles that every major firm uses now. CEO. Anthony Russo crossed his arms, frowning deeply. I could practically see my promotion chances evaporating with each nod around the table. The chief risk officer position I'd been working toward for 5 years, the validation that would finally prove my worth in this increasingly digital world, where experience seemed to matter less than algorithms. When applied retroactively to the 2020 market crash, Derek explained, displaying a carefully crafted comparison slide, this model would have completely missed the recovery timing. Our clients would have been caught unprepared, potentially losing millions while competitors using modern analytics capitalized on the rebound. The numbers he was showing looked impressive, but I knew something was wrong with his analysis. I'd actually tested my models against that exact scenario, and they'd performed better than he was claiming, but challenging him now would look like desperate deflection. Director Wells shook her head slowly. This is deeply troubling, Michael. We trusted you to keep us competitive. I've already begun implementing proper AI-driven methodologies, Derek assured her with practiced confidence. With immediate intervention, we can still present cutting-edge analytics to Wellington Bank next week. We don't have to lose our biggest client because of this situation. The message couldn't have been clearer. He should lead the Wellington account, our most prestigious client worth $3.2 million annually. The promotion we'd both been competing for would be his, along with the respect and recognition I'd spent decades earning. And you're certain these traditional methods are fundamentally flawed? Russo asked directly, his tone suggesting the conversation was already over in his mind. Without question, Derek replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone half my age who'd never lived through a real market crash. They represent legacy thinking that has no place in modern risk management. Frankly, I'm surprised we've tolerated this approach for so long. After 45 excruciating minutes of watching my professional reputation being methodically destroyed, Wells finally turned to me. The room had the same tense silence I remembered from military briefings where careers hung in the balance. "Michael, do you have anything to say in response to these concerns?" Every head in the room swiveled toward me like I was some relic from a bygone era. Throughout Derek's entire presentation, I hadn't made a sound, hadn't interrupted, hadn't tried to defend myself. My heart pounded as I considered my response carefully, the way my drill instructor taught me to assess situations before acting. Sometimes the best tactical move is to let your enemy expose himself completely. "Just one question," I said calmly, meeting Derek's eyes directly across the polished conference table. "Can you explain why Wellington Bank specifically requested this exact traditional approach in their initial contract brief?" The room went dead silent. Derek's confident expression faltered for just a moment, so brief that most people probably missed it, but I'd spent years learning to read faces under pressure. In the Marines, missing that kind of micro-expression could get people killed. Let me back up and explain how I got to that moment, sitting in a boardroom watching a colleague I'd trusted systematically destroy everything I'd worked for. The story really starts 4 years earlier when I transitioned from military service to civilian corporate life, determined to prove that old-school values and methodical thinking still had a place in modern business. I'd spent my 20s in the Corps, serving 2 tours in the Gulf War before using my GI Bill benefits to earn an MBA from University of Chicago. The transition wasn't easy, going from the clear hierarchies and direct communication of military service to the subtle politics and unspoken rules of corporate America. But I figured if I kept my head down, did excellent work, and treated people with respect, merit would speak for itself. At Keystone Financial, I slowly built my reputation by taking on the accounts others avoided, the complicated ones requiring deep analysis of systemic risks that couldn't be captured in pretty PowerPoint slides. While other analysts focused on quarterly performance metrics, I studied long-term patterns, the kind of underlying structural weaknesses that could devastate portfolios when markets turned ugly. My approach wasn't glamorous, but it worked. During the 2008 financial crisis, while other firms were blindsided by subprime mortgage collapses, my risk models had flagged potential problems months earlier. My clients avoided the worst losses, and my reputation as someone who could spot trouble before it hit became my calling card. The work suited my personality perfectly. I'd grown up in a blue-collar family in Toledo where my father worked 30 years at the glass plant, teaching me that steady, honest work was its own reward. The military had reinforced those values: attention to detail, personal accountability, and the understanding that lives could depend on getting things right the first time. Derek Collins joined Keystone 2 years after I did, hired straight out of business school with an impressive technical background and ideas about revolutionizing risk management through artificial intelligence. From day one, he was everything I wasn't: outspoken, politically savvy, and convinced that traditional approaches were obsolete. At first, I actually respected his technical abilities. The financial industry was changing rapidly, and I knew staying competitive meant adapting to new tools and methodologies. When Derek approached me during his first month, asking questions about my models and expressing genuine interest in learning from my experience, I was flattered. "You've got institutional knowledge that's invaluable," he'd said over coffee in the break room. "I'd love to understand how you develop your stress test scenarios. The academic models don't capture what you learn from actually living through market cycles." I opened up to him completely, sharing not just my methodologies but the reasoning behind them. I explained how I'd learned to spot early warning signals during the dot-com bubble, how certain correlation patterns preceded major volatility events, and how traditional fundamental analysis could enhance rather than compete with algorithmic approaches. Derek seemed fascinated, taking detailed notes and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated real understanding. I began to see our relationship as mentorship, the experienced professional helping the talented newcomer understand the complexities of real-world risk management. Over the following months, we collaborated on several smaller projects. Derek handled the technical implementation while I provided strategic oversight and client interface. It seemed like an ideal partnership, his cutting-edge tools enhanced by my market experience. Clients appreciated getting both innovation and institutional knowledge, but gradually, I noticed subtle changes in our dynamic. Derek began presenting our joint work to leadership with himself positioned as the primary contributor. In meetings, he'd reference my analysis or my risk models when discussing projects we'd developed together. When I raised this privately, he brushed off my concerns. "We're a team, Michael. No one's keeping score of individual contributions. What matters is delivering results for the firm." I let it slide, figuring the work spoke for itself and that leadership understood both our roles. Looking back, that was probably my biggest mistake, assuming everyone operated with the same straightforward approach I'd learned in the military. Then came the opportunity that changed everything: the Wellington bank account. Regional banks like Wellington represented Keystone's bread and butter, conservative institutions that valued stability and proven track records over flashy innovation. When they put their quarterly risk assessment contract up for bid after their previous firm missed several key warning signs, it became the biggest prize of the year. Director Wells made it clear that whoever successfully led the Wellington account would be promoted to Chief Risk Officer, the position I'd been quietly working toward for years. It wasn't just about money, though the salary increase would finally let Sarah and me start thinking seriously about retirement planning. It was about validation, proof that experience and steady competence could still triumph in an increasingly youth-obsessed industry. When Wells assigned both Derek and me to the initial client meeting, I knew we were being evaluated head-to-head. The competition was finally out in the open, and I was confident my track record would speak for itself. Wellington's representatives were different from typical clients. Instead of junior managers looking for the cheapest option, they sent their senior leadership team, including Dr. Gerald Hoffman, their head of risk management. Dr. Hoffman was my age, a veteran of multiple market cycles who'd learned hard lessons during previous crises. "We're looking for battle-tested approaches," Dr. Hoffman explained during our first meeting. Our previous firm relied heavily on AI models that looked impressive in presentations, but failed to predict the unique aspects of recent market disruptions. We need analysts who understand both traditional fundamentals and modern tools. I felt recognition click immediately. This was exactly what my hybrid approach delivered: the institutional knowledge of someone who'd lived through multiple market cycles combined with current analytical capabilities. When Dr. Hoffman asked about my methodology, I walked him through my framework for combining historical pattern recognition with algorithmic analysis. Traditional stress testing focuses on statistical probabilities, I explained, but real market crises often involve correlation breakdowns that pure algorithms miss. Human judgment, informed by experience, can identify potential failure points that models overlook. Dr. Hoffman leaned forward with genuine interest. "Exactly. We've seen too many firms get blindsided because they trusted the math without understanding the underlying assumptions." Derek, meanwhile, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation focused on proven experience rather than cutting-edge algorithms. When Dr. Hoffman asked him about his approach to crisis prediction, Derek launched into a presentation about machine learning capabilities and real-time data processing that sounded impressive but felt disconnected from the practical concerns Wellington was raising. After the meeting, Wells pulled me aside in the hallway. "Wellington was impressed with your background, Michael. They specifically requested that you lead the technical analysis phase." Her words should have felt like victory, but I could see Derek's reflection in the conference room glass behind her, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. Derek's congratulations were professionally warm, but I caught the edge in his voice. "Great news, Michael. I'll handle client communications while you focus on the modeling," he offered. "We'll make a great team on this one." For the next 3 months, I poured everything into developing hybrid models that captured both traditional risk patterns and modern market dynamics. I spent late nights at the office, testing my approach against historical data, refining the algorithms until they successfully predicted 76% of significant market movements from the previous 5 years, far exceeding the 59% accuracy of pure AI models that most firms relied on. The work was technically demanding but personally satisfying. I was creating something that bridged two worlds: the institutional knowledge I'd accumulated over decades and the computational power of modern analytics. It felt like the culmination of everything I'd learned about markets, risk, and human psychology. When Derek asked about my progress during our weekly check-ins, I shared everything openly. He seemed genuinely fascinated, asking detailed questions about my methodology that I interpreted as professional curiosity. I walked him through each innovation, explaining the reasoning behind my hybrid approach and how traditional pattern recognition could enhance algorithmic analysis. "This correlation matrix is brilliant," he said one evening, studying my latest model output. "How did you identify these underlying relationships?" I was proud to explain my thinking, believing we were collaborating as professionals should. It comes from experience with multiple market cycles. Pure AI models miss these connections because they're not statistically obvious. They only become clear when you understand the behavioral patterns that drive institutional decision-making. What I didn't realize was that Derek had stopped sharing my progress updates with Wellington weeks earlier. Instead, he'd been meeting privately with Director Wells, carefully building a narrative that I was taking too long and veering dangerously off course from accepted industry practices. "Michael's always been resistant to innovation," he'd apparently told Wells during one of their coffee meetings. "I'm concerned he's letting his ego interfere with delivering what Wellington actually needs. The client expects modern analytics, not outdated approaches dressed up with fancy terminology." These conversations happened while I was heads down on the technical work, trusting Derek to handle the political aspects of client management. In retrospect, it was naive to assume he shared my straightforward approach to professional relationships, but my military background had taught me to focus on the mission while trusting teammates to handle their assigned responsibilities. The first sign of trouble came during a routine project review meeting. Wells seemed unusually concerned about timeline and deliverables, asking pointed questions about methodology that felt like she was testing my competence rather than seeking updates. "Are you certain this hybrid approach aligns with current industry standards?" she asked, reviewing my latest presentation materials. "I've been hearing concerns about whether we're overthinking this project." I assured her that Wellington had specifically requested this methodology, but I could see doubt in her expression. When I mentioned discussing the approach with Dr. Hoffman, she seemed surprised. "Derek's been handling client communications. Are you having direct contact with Wellington without coordination?" The question caught me off guard. I assumed you knew about my weekly strategy sessions with their technical team. Dr. Hoffman specifically requested regular updates on methodology development. Wells frowned. "I haven't received any reports about these sessions. Derek, can you clarify the communication protocol with Wellington?" Derek looked momentarily uncomfortable before smoothly responding. "There may have been some informal technical discussions, but all official client communications have been channeled through me as we agreed. Michael, we should probably coordinate better to avoid confusion." Walking back to my office afterward, I felt the first real stirrings of concern. Something was off about Derek's response, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what bothered me about it. The military had taught me to trust my instincts about team dynamics, and my instincts were telling me that information wasn't flowing properly. That evening, I decided to document everything more carefully. I started keeping detailed records of my conversations with Wellington's team, backing up all project files to secure locations and maintaining a timeline of all significant decisions and communications. It was probably excessive, but my military experience had taught me that proper documentation could be crucial when situations became complicated. The presentation ambush 3 weeks later proved my precautions were justified. Derek had orchestrated the boardroom confrontation with surgical precision, positioning himself as the responsible professional saving the company from my reckless experimentation. He'd spent weeks laying groundwork with leadership while I focused naively on technical excellence. Watching him dismantle my work in front of the executive team, I finally understood the depth of his deception. This wasn't professional disagreement or miscommunication. It was calculated sabotage, designed to eliminate me as competition for the Wellington account and the promotion that came with it. But Derek had made one critical mistake. In his eagerness to discredit my traditional approach, he'd overlooked the fact that Wellington had specifically requested exactly what I'd delivered. His entire presentation was based on the premise that clients wanted pure algorithmic solutions, when the reality was precisely the opposite. When I asked my simple question about Wellington's requirements, I could see the color drain from Derek's face. He'd built his entire case on a foundation of lies, and now the truth was about to collapse his carefully constructed narrative. The silence in the boardroom stretched for long seconds before Derek attempted to recover. "I'm not aware of any specific request for traditional methodologies. The client expects industry-standard analysis." I reached into my briefcase with deliberate calm, the same methodical precision I'd learned during weapons inspections in the Corps. I retrieved the bound contract document, sliding it across the polished conference table towards CEO Russo with the same deliberate control I'd used countless times during military briefings. This is Wellington Bank's project specification. Page 12 outlines their explicit requirements for hybrid modeling, combining institutional knowledge with algorithmic insights, exactly what I implemented and what Derek just spent an hour criticizing. Russo opened the document immediately, his expression shifting from skeptical to intrigued as he scanned the pages. The room's energy changed palpably as other executives leaned forward, sensing that the narrative was about to take an unexpected turn. Wellington's risk management team has been researching hybrid approaches for 18 months, I continued, keeping my voice steady and professional. What Derek characterizes as outdated methodology is actually the battle-tested foundation they specifically commissioned after their previous firm's pure AI models failed during recent market volatility. Director Wells reached across the table for the contract, her face darkening as she read. Derek started to speak, but I wasn't finished. Dr. Hoffman can confirm everything, I said, maintaining eye contact with Russo. I've been in weekly strategy sessions with their technical team throughout this project, documenting their requirements and refining the approach based on their feedback. I assumed everyone at leadership level was aware of their specialized needs. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable pause after Derek's presentation. This was the silence of executives processing new information that completely reframed their understanding of the situation. Derek attempted to recover, his voice slightly higher than normal. There must be some misunderstanding about the scope of client requirements. Even if they mentioned interest in traditional approaches, industry best practices would suggest, page 8, I interrupted calmly, pointing to a specific section of the contract. It documents Wellington's backtesting results comparing pure AI models with hybrid approaches. Algorithmic-only solutions identified 59% of major market movements over their test period. Their requested hybrid methodology caught 76% and provided earlier warning signals for portfolio protection. Russo looked up sharply from the document. Is this performance data verified? Dr. Hoffman can authenticate everything, I replied. Wellington chose Keystone specifically because they believed we could deliver this hybrid approach. They've been disappointed with firms that rely exclusively on algorithmic analysis without institutional context. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Derek had built his entire presentation around the premise that traditional methods were obsolete, but Wellington had hired us precisely because they wanted to move beyond pure algorithmic solutions that had failed them. Wells closed the contract brief, her expression unreadable. I think we need to pause and verify some information with our client directly. Derek, Michael, thank you both for your presentations. The executive team will need to discuss this situation privately. As we filed out of the boardroom, Derek grabbed my arm in the hallway, pulling me into an empty conference room. His carefully maintained composure had cracked, revealing the desperate ambition underneath. "What kind of game are you playing?" he hissed, his professional facade completely gone. "You made me look incompetent in there." I gently removed his hand from my arm, the way I'd been trained to de-escalate confrontations without escalating them. I simply clarified the client's actual requirements, Derek. The same requirements you were present for during our initial meeting with Dr. Hoffman. We both know Wellington would never approve those antiquated models long term. You're just trying to buy time before they realize what you've actually delivered. I studied his face, finally seeing clearly the person I'd been dealing with for months. Dr. Hoffman personally requested this hybrid approach. You heard him explain why pure AI models failed their previous firm. Traditional experience was exactly what they wanted. "That's not how Director Wells will remember those meetings," he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "We've discussed your resistance to modernization extensively over the past few months, your reputation for being difficult to work with." The pieces fell into place with crystal clarity. While I'd been focused on technical excellence, Derek had been conducting a systematic campaign to undermine my credibility with leadership. Every casual coffee meeting, every informal conversation had been carefully orchestrated to build a narrative that I was an obstacle to progress. "You should prepare yourself," he added with manufactured sympathy. "Even if they don't terminate you immediately, your career here is finished. No one trusts an analyst who can't adapt to modern methodologies." He left me standing in the conference room, his confident stride suggesting he still believed his political maneuvering would ultimately prevail over documented facts. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset and thinking about integrity. My phone buzzed with a text from Director Wells, meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. with Wellington representatives present. The next morning arrived crisp and clear. I reached the office early, using the quiet time to review my documentation one final time. When Derek arrived, he looked untroubled, apparently confident that his version of events would carry the day. At exactly 9 a.m., Dr. Hoffman entered the conference room with two colleagues from Wellington's risk management team. The atmosphere immediately became formal and serious. "Thank you for convening on short notice," Wells began. "We need immediate clarification regarding the Wellington Risk Assessment Project. Dr. Hoffman has agreed to provide his perspective on client requirements." Dr. Hoffman placed his tablet on the table, his expression grave. "I was quite disturbed to receive standard algorithmic projections yesterday from Mr. Collins, particularly after the promising hybrid analytics Mr. Reynolds had been developing specifically for our needs." Derek's head snapped up, color draining from his face. "I believed the methodology needed updating to meet current industry standards," Derek said weakly. "Industry standards are precisely what we hired Keystone to move beyond," Dr. Hoffman interrupted firmly. "As I made explicitly clear in our initial contract and subsequent communications, pure AI models consistently failed to identify the risk patterns most critical to our portfolio strategy." Wells leaned forward intently. "Dr. Hoffman, to be absolutely clear, you specifically requested Michael's hybrid modeling approach. Not only requested it, we insisted on it as a condition for awarding Keystone this contract," he confirmed. "Mr. Reynolds' methodology aligns perfectly with our research requirements. When Mr. Collins sent standard algorithmic projections yesterday, claiming they represented Keystone's official analysis, I was concerned there had been serious miscommunication about our core requirements." The room fell completely silent. Derek's carefully constructed narrative had just been demolished by the very client he'd claimed to understand. "There has clearly been significant internal communication failure," Russo said carefully. "Rest assured, Dr. Hoffman, Wellington will receive the hybrid analytics you commissioned, delivered by Michael, who developed them according to your specifications." After Wellington's team departed, Wells asked me to remain while dismissing Derek with a curt nod. When we were alone, she sighed heavily. "This situation is unprecedented, Michael. Had Wellington received the standard analysis Derek proposed, we would have lost our largest client." She paused, removing her glasses. "I owe you an apology. I should have verified client requirements directly instead of accepting filtered information. The chief risk officer position was mine, effective immediately. Derek was quietly reassigned to internal analytics, where client contact was minimal. 2 weeks later, he left for a junior position at a struggling fintech startup. Victory felt different than I'd expected. Not triumphant, but quietly satisfying in the way that doing the right thing well always feels. The experience taught me that in corporate America, competence needs protection from those willing to manipulate perceptions, but it also confirmed something I'd always believed. Integrity and documented excellence, when properly defended, ultimately prevail over political maneuvering. My hybrid models continued delivering superior results for Wellington and other clients who valued experience combined with innovation. The promotion validated not just my technical abilities, but the enduring worth of institutional knowledge in an algorithmic world. Sometimes the most powerful response to calculated deception isn't emotional confrontation, it's simply ensuring the truth becomes visible to everyone who needs to see it. In a world that worships innovation, the most revolutionary act is sometimes proving that wisdom earned through experience remains irreplaceable. The young mistake complexity for sophistication, but true mastery lies in knowing when simple, proven principles outperform elaborate algorithms.